The morning the water alarms finally screamed to life, the HOA president was standing right where my cattle used to graze. She had a ribbon in one hand, a microphone in the other, and that practiced smile people wear when they think they've already won. Behind her, 57 brand-new houses sat in neat, soulless rows, poured over soil my family had worked for 4 generations. Fresh concrete, fresh paint, fresh arrogance. She believed it was permanent. She believed wrong. She had no idea that everything behind her was built downstream from a federally regulated, flood-controlled dam that predates her entire homeowners association by decades. A dam my grandfather helped design back when permits meant law, not favors. My name is Caleb Rourke. That ranch wasn't unused land, no matter how many times the HOA said it out loud. They told the county I was difficult. They told buyers I was irrelevant. They told everyone they had every approval they needed. What they never told anyone was that water rights do not care about HOA votes, speeches, or fake emergencies. I didn't protest. I didn't yell. I didn't stop them. I waited. I watched every house go up, and when they were finished, I did the one thing they never expected. I followed the law. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I grew up on that ranch outside the small town of Red Willow Ridge, Colorado, the kind of place where people recognize your truck before they remember your name. Dirt roads, long winters, and neighbors who wave even if they do not like you. My grandparents homesteaded that land after the war, carving a life out of rock, snow, and stubbornness. My parents took it over and ran cattle the same way they raised us, steady, quiet, and without shortcuts. That ranch was never just property. It was birthdays in the barn, fence repairs at sunrise, and my mother ringing the dinner bell so loud you could hear it across the pasture. Then one winter, everything broke at once. A highway accident took both my parents within the same year, no warning. No goodbye. Suddenly, it was just me and my younger sister Marlene, sitting on the porch in the evenings, staring at land that felt too big and too empty at the same time. Grief settled into the house like dust you could never fully wipe away. Every morning still smelled like coffee and hay, but nothing felt anchored anymore. That was when the letters started coming. At first, they looked harmless. Polite envelopes, friendly language. Notices about surveys, soil testing, and environmental reviews. They came from something called the High Mesa Estates Homeowners Association, which made no sense, because there were no homes there yet. The name signed at the bottom was Lydia Henshaw, president. She wrote about development opportunities and responsible growth as if those words automatically meant good intentions. I ignored most of them, assuming it was another developer fishing for interest. Then Lydia showed up in person. She pulled into the drive in a spotless SUV, stepped out in clean boots that had never seen mud, and smiled like she already knew how the conversation would end. She talked fast, confident, explaining how the county was eager for expansion and how our land was perfectly positioned for the future. She said things like community and progress, but she never once asked what we wanted. When Marlene mentioned our parents, Lydia nodded politely and kept talking, already flipping through her folder. The letters changed after that. They stopped sounding friendly. Deadlines appeared. Phrases like failure to respond and assumed consent showed up in bold print. One notice claimed survey access had already been approved. Another mentioned environmental concerns tied to cattle runoff, written in a way that made us sound reckless. Each letter arrived faster than the last, as if speed itself was the weapon. The day it stopped being theoretical was the day I came home to find wooden survey stakes hammered straight into my east pasture. Bright flags snapped in the wind where my cattle had grazed for decades. Lines were marked across ground my father had taught me to walk and read like a map. No phone call, no agreement, no knock on the door, just strangers claiming space by putting sticks in the dirt. I drove straight into town, and found Lydia in her office, calm as ever. When I demanded an explanation, she didn't raise her voice or apologize. She smiled, leaned back in her chair, and said, "The county approved it. You should have paid closer attention." That sentence landed heavier than any threat. I realized then that this wasn't a paperwork mix-up or an overeager developer misunderstanding boundaries. This was intentional. They had already decided the outcome, and everything else was just noise meant to wear me down. They were counting on grief, exhaustion, and isolation to do the rest. Marlene saw it too. She stopped talking about saving the ranch emotionally and started asking questions strategically. Who approved what? When? Under which authority? Meanwhile, I watched trucks start to idle along the fence line, watched strangers point at land they did not own, and listened to neighbors repeat rumors that somehow painted me as the obstacle. The ranch had survived blizzards, droughts, and generations of hard living. What it had not prepared us for was a smiling HOA with a clipboard, moving faster than truth and calling it progress. The HOA did not creep in. It rushed. It moved faster than anything I had ever seen in Red Willow Ridge, a town where most decisions took months and everyone argued about them first. Notices for emergency zoning meetings appeared with barely any warning, sometimes posted late in the evening and scheduled for the next morning. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the meetings were already over. I attended the first one I could, sitting in a folding chair at the back of the room, listening as charts and renderings flashed across a screen like a sales pitch. County Commissioner Ronald Pike sat at the front, nodding along as if he had memorized every slide. He never asked a hard question. He never paused the presentation. When someone raised a concern, Pike glanced at the clock and said they were short on time. Every motion passed cleanly, unanimously, and fast. On paper, lines shifted. Boundaries changed. Setbacks were reinterpreted. But out on the land, the fences were exactly where they had been for decades. The first bulldozer showed up before dawn. I heard it before I saw it, the low mechanical growl cutting through the quiet morning air. When I reached the east pasture, floodlights were already blazing, throwing harsh white beams across ground that had never needed them. Steel tracks chewed into the soil, ripping up grass my father had planted with his own hands. I stood there in boots and a jacket, breath fogging in the cold, watching dirt roll like it was nothing. I called the sheriff. He arrived slowly, parked behind the machinery, and took his hat off before he spoke. He looked tired, like a man who already knew the answer. He said the county paperwork was in order and that his hands were tied. When I asked how someone could bulldoze my land without permission, he shifted his weight and said the words that would haunt the rest of this fight. "It's a civil matter." Those 3 words became the HOA's shield. Anytime I objected, anytime I called for help, those words came back at me. Civil matter, not urgent, not criminal, not his problem. The machines did not stop. Within days, the local news picked it up. The story did not look like the truth. It showed polished renderings of smiling families and called the project much-needed housing. I was described as a stubborn landowner refusing to cooperate with progress. They quoted Lydia Henshaw talking about community needs and painted me as a single man standing in the way of dozens of families. Online, it got worse. Community pages filled with comments calling me selfish and greedy. People who had never set foot on my ranch suddenly had opinions about what I owed the town. Someone spray-painted "Move On" across the side of my barn one night, the red letters dripping like an accusation. I scrubbed it off before Marlene could see it, but the message stayed anyway. Marlene felt it too. At the grocery store, neighbors she had known since childhood cornered her in the aisles, asking why we hated families, why we were holding everyone back. One woman told her she should be ashamed. Marlene came home shaking, furious, and hurt all at once, asking how everything had turned upside down so fast. I tried to fight back the way people say you are supposed to. I hired a lawyer. Then another. We filed for injunctions. We requested hearings. We submitted evidence. Each attempt felt like punching water. Every document I brought in was met with another document already stamped and approved. Every objection was answered with a clause I had never been told about. Lydia always seemed ready, sliding new approvals across the table before my lawyer even finished speaking. At meetings, she never raised her voice. She smiled, corrected small details, and reminded everyone that the project was already underway. She talked about sunk costs and timelines, about how delays would hurt innocent buyers. The room always turned quiet when she said that, like the blame had shifted without anyone noticing. Meanwhile, concrete trucks rolled in day after day. Foundations were poured where my cattle used to bed down. Framing went up fast, walls appearing almost overnight. I stood at the fence line some evenings, hands in my pockets, watching the land change shape. The ranch that had once stretched open and familiar now looked smaller every day, carved into neat squares and straight roads that ignored the way water actually moved. Every night, I went to bed exhausted and angry, feeling like I was losing something piece by piece. The worst part was the speed. There was no time to breathe, no time to grieve what was happening. It felt deliberate, like they knew if they moved fast enough the truth would never catch up. I watched my land disappear under concrete, knowing that once it was finished, everyone would say it was too late to fix. The turning point did not come from a courtroom, a heated meeting, or some dramatic confrontation. It came quietly, buried under dust and neglect, in a records room most people had forgotten even existed. While I was busy reacting to bulldozers and letters stamped with authority, Marlene was doing something far more dangerous to the HOA's plan. She was reading. She took time off from work and spent her days in the county records office, down in the basement where the air smelled like old paper and neglect. The clerk down there barely looked up anymore. Boxes were stacked in crooked towers. Files were mislabeled, half-faded, and never digitized because no one thought they mattered. Marlene thought otherwise. She worked methodically, the same way our father used to mend fences, one broken section at a time. Weeks passed with nothing but fragments, old land grants, survey maps drawn by hand, easements that had changed names but not meanings. I was close to telling her it was pointless when she called me one afternoon, her voice tight but steady, the way it used to sound when she had figured something out before anyone else. "Caleb," she said, barely breathing. "They only bought surface rights. I did not understand it at first." Surface rights sounded technical, harmless even. But Marlene explained it slowly, carefully, like she was afraid the words might break if she rushed them. High Mesa Estates had acquired development rights tied to surface use agreements that had been quietly separated decades earlier. What they did not own were the deeper rights that actually controlled the land's most powerful feature: water. Buried in records from the 1940s was a completely separate set of documents tied to the dam upstream. A flood control structure built after a catastrophic snowmelt disaster that had nearly wiped out towns downstream. It was not a local project. It was federal, Army engineers, federal authority, federal rules that did not bend for county commissioners or homeowners associations. My grandfather's name was there in black ink, listed as part of the original engineering committee. I stared at it for a long time when Marlene laid the papers out on the kitchen table. I remembered him talking about that dam when I was a kid, about how water was patient but unforgiving, and how people who ignored it always paid eventually. The dam was governed by strict operational rules. Seasonal releases during peak snowmelt were mandatory, not optional, not negotiable. No waivers for development. No exceptions for progress. The purpose was simple: relieve pressure before nature did it violently. And High Mesa Estates sat directly in the designated flood path. The realization hit me all at once, like cold water down the spine. Those neat rows of houses, the freshly poured foundations, the smiling renderings in the news, none of them had federal clearance tied to flood control compliance. There were no valid flood insurance approvals, no Army Corps sign-off, no mitigation plans that met federal standards. On paper, the HOA looked unstoppable. In reality, they were standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, protected only by ignorance and speed. For the first time since the bulldozers arrived, I stopped feeling like I was drowning. I stopped making frantic calls. I stopped reacting to Lydia's letters and deadlines. I stopped trying to outrun a machine designed to exhaust me. Instead, I slowed down. Marlene and I laid everything out. Maps, timelines, old manuals written in language that did not care about marketing or public opinion. The dam's operating requirements were clear. Snowpack levels were rising fast after a heavy winter. Seasonal release windows were approaching, and they were governed by federal oversight, not county approval. What struck me hardest was how obvious it all was once you knew where to look. The HOA had relied on one thing above all else, that no one would dig far enough back to challenge them. They assumed everyone would argue at the surface level about zoning and meetings and noise and fairness. They never imagined someone would go deeper. I could see now why Lydia had been so confident, why she rushed construction, why she kept repeating that phrase about sunk costs and timelines. She believed that once the houses were standing, reality would be forced to adjust around them. She was wrong. From that moment on, everything changed, not on the outside. The machines kept running, the concrete kept pouring. Lydia kept smiling for cameras, but inside me, the panic was gone. In its place was something steadier, heavier, and far more dangerous to the HOA. I was no longer fighting their process. I was preparing to follow a law older than their entire operation. And water, unlike people, never negotiates. I reached out to Earl Donovan because he was the kind of man who had seen systems fail long before anyone admitted they were broken. He had spent his entire career working on water control projects, flood mitigation, and dam safety across 3 states, and he had retired with a reputation for being careful to the point of annoyance. When I drove out to his place and spread the documents across his kitchen table, he did not react right away. He read slowly, tracing lines with one finger, pausing at dates and signatures that most people would have skipped. After a long silence, he leaned back in his chair and said, "They built where they were never supposed to." That was all I needed to hear. What we put together after that was not a scheme or a stunt. It was not revenge, it was compliance. Every step was grounded in regulations that existed long before High Mesa Estates was a name on a brochure. Earl helped me organize the documents in the order federal agencies cared about, not the order that made the HOA look good. We reviewed historical snowpack data, seasonal runoff patterns, and the operational manuals tied to the dam upstream. Nothing flashy, nothing emotional, just facts that did not bend. We notified the appropriate federal water authority exactly the way the manuals required. Formal letters, certified delivery, clear documentation. We did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. We did not threaten action. We simply reported conditions and reminded them of mandatory release requirements tied to rising snowmelt levels. Then we waited. While we worked quietly, Lydia did the opposite. Construction accelerated. Marketing banners went up along the highway. Open house signs appeared overnight. She stood in front of cameras talking about safe, family-friendly living and fully approved development. Buyers were rushed through contracts, encouraged to lock in before prices rose. Every word she spoke was louder, faster, and more desperate than the last. I stopped responding publicly. No interviews. No town meetings. No arguments in parking lots. When people asked what I was going to do, I told them nothing. That silence made Lydia nervous. She filled it with her own voice, accusing me of stalling progress and spreading fear. She sent letters demanding I cease interference with ongoing development activities. Earl laughed when he read them. The letters had no teeth. They were written to intimidate, not enforce. Behind the scenes, the tone changed. Federal inspectors requested additional information from the county. Insurance providers started asking questions about flood compliance. One major insurer quietly withdrew coverage from the project without explanation. Another delayed approvals indefinitely. Lydia brushed it off publicly, calling it routine paperwork. Privately, she started calling me more often, her messages shorter and sharper. I still did not respond. The pressure began to show in small ways. Construction crews slowed. Deliveries were delayed. Subcontractors complained about uncertainty. Lydia sent me cease and desist letters weekly, each one more dramatic than the last, accusing me of harassment, interference, and bad faith. None of them referenced any law that mattered. What struck me most was how quickly confidence turned into panic once the system she did not control began to move. She had mastered county approvals and HOA votes. She had no experience dealing with federal oversight that did not care about her timeline or her talking points. Earl reminded me constantly to stay patient. "The moment you rush," he said, "you give them something to grab onto." So we stayed slow. We answered every official question fully and calmly. We documented everything. We let the process unfold exactly as written. Lydia interpreted my silence as weakness. She started telling buyers that I had backed down. She claimed the remaining concerns were resolved. She even hinted at legal action against me for delaying progress. The irony was that the more she talked, the more evidence piled up that she had ignored critical requirements. Every statement she made was recorded. Every promise to buyers contradicted federal documentation. By the time she realized something was wrong, it was too late to fix quietly. Inspectors were scheduled, reports were flagged. Questions were being asked at levels she could not reach. The ground beneath High Mesa Estates had not changed, but the assumptions holding it all together were crumbling. She believed silence meant surrender. What it really meant was that I had stopped fighting her game entirely. I was following a rule book written decades before she ever learned the word development, and once those rules started turning, nothing she said could stop them. Spring arrived the way it always did in the high country, quietly at first and then all at once. The snowpack in the mountains had been heavy that year, deeper than average, and as the days warmed, meltwater began feeding into the system exactly the way the old manual said it would. Earl and I watched the readings climb with a kind of calm focus that surprised me. There was no panic left in it, just inevitability. Under federal supervision, inspections were scheduled and completed, not rushed. Not dramatic. Clipboards, checklists, and calm voices. Every valve was checked, every gauge verified. Every conversation was logged, every phone call recorded. The officials did not argue or speculate. They followed procedure, because procedure was the point. This was not about intent or emotion. It was about pressure, capacity, and law. While that was happening, Lydia tried to regain control of the narrative. She called an emergency town meeting and packed the room with residents and buyers. I showed up quietly and took a seat near the back. She stood at the front with a microphone, her voice sharp and rehearsed, accusing me of planning sabotage. She used phrases like weaponizing water and intentional harm, repeating them until they echoed around the room. She warned people that I was dangerous, that I was willing to flood homes out of spite. When she finally pointed at me and demanded a response, the room went silent. I stood up once. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain the history or the documents. I said 6 words. "I'm following the law." That was it. I sat back down. The meeting dissolved into arguments and whispers, but I was already done. The truth did not need defending in that room. It was waiting somewhere else. That night, I barely slept, not because I was afraid, but because I understood the weight of what was about to happen. I thought about my grandfather, about the way he used to talk about water like it was a living thing. I thought about my parents and the land they trusted me with. I thought about the people who had been rushed into believing those houses were safe. At dawn, the officials gathered at the dam. The air was cold and clear, the kind of morning where sound carries farther than it should. Earl stood beside me, calm as ever, reviewing the final checklist. Cameras were rolling, not for drama, but for documentation. The release gates were opened according to schedule, slowly at first, just enough to relieve pressure. Then steadily, the way they were designed to work. Water did what water always does. It followed gravity. It followed channels, older than fences, older than zoning maps, older than anyone pretending they could outvote physics. It moved downhill, calm and relentless, exactly where the flood control models said it would go. By mid-morning, the first calls came in. Construction zones were flooding, trenches filled faster than pumps could clear them. Freshly poured foundations began to crack under shifting ground. Streets that had never existed a year earlier turned into shallow rivers, water running along curbs and through unfinished driveways. Workers dropped tools and scrambled for higher ground. No one was hurt. The homes were still empty, but the image everyone had been sold collapsed in real time. Sirens echoed through Red Willow Ridge, bouncing off hills that had seen floods long before anyone thought to build on them. Lydia arrived on site screaming, demanding someone stop the water, demanding answers from people who were already documenting everything. She shouted about liability and sabotage, while officials calmly pointed to the release orders and the federal authority behind them. Cameras captured the moment her confidence cracked, her words tumbling over each other as reality refused to cooperate. By afternoon, the site was shut down. Inspectors moved through the area, taking photos, measurements, notes. The damage was not catastrophic, but it was undeniable. The illusion of safety was gone, washed clean by something far more powerful than an HOA vote. News crews showed up, this time filming soaked concrete and buckled ground instead of glossy renderings. I stood at the edge of the site and watched water move the way it always had, the way my grandfather had warned it would. It was not angry. It was not cruel. It was simply honest. By evening, the town understood what Lydia never had. You can rush permits. You can bully neighbors. You can silence objections with speed and paperwork. But you cannot argue with gravity. Lydia arrived on site like a storm of her own, heels sinking into wet ground as she screamed at anyone close enough to hear her. She pointed at inspectors, construction managers, even buyers who had shown up in disbelief. Her voice cracked as she accused everyone in sight of sabotage, conspiracy, and betrayal. Cameras followed her every move, because chaos draws attention faster than truth ever does. Buyers stood in small clusters, phones pressed to their ears, panic creeping into conversations that had once been excited plans. Some stared at the waterlogged foundations in silence, trying to understand how something sold as safe and permanent could unravel in a single day. County officials arrived late and left early, their confidence evaporating the moment they realized this situation was no longer under their control. Then, the federal investigators stepped in. There was no shouting, no arguing, no emotional speeches. They moved with the calm precision of people who had already seen the end of this story. One by one, they laid documents out on folding tables that had been hastily set up near the site. Thick folders, sealed envelopes, reports with dates that went back months, even years, illegal permits, misrepresented flood data, fraudulent disclosures signed and submitted as fact. The air shifted as each page was turned. Lydia tried to interrupt, insisting the county had approved everything, insisting she had been misled, insisting this was all my doing. She pointed at me from across the site, yelling that I had planned this, that I had manipulated the system to destroy her project. The investigators barely looked at her. One of them calmly explained that federal law did not answer to homeowners associations, county commissioners, or development schedules. Another pointed out that mandatory flood disclosures had been altered or omitted entirely. A third investigator outlined how emergency zoning approvals had been granted based on incomplete and misleading environmental reports. Lydia's words started to fall apart. Her accusations turned into excuses. Her excuses turned into silence. Law outranked HOA authority, just like water outranked concrete. By late afternoon, a formal stop work order was issued. Equipment was shut down where it stood. Crews were dismissed. Barriers went up around the site. The project that had been rushed forward at breakneck speed came to a full stop in a matter of hours. By sunset, the confidence that had carried Lydia through months of bulldozing opposition was gone. She sat in her vehicle with the door open, staring straight ahead while investigators continued their work around her. Cameras caught the moment she realized this was not something she could spin away. The fallout moved fast after that. Within days, charges were filed against multiple HOA board members for fraud, falsification of records, and failure to disclose known flood risks. Subpoenas followed. Bank accounts were frozen. Legal notices piled up faster than Lydia's letters ever had. County Commissioner Ronald Pike resigned quietly, citing personal reasons, though no one in Red Willow Ridge believed that explanation for a second. The news stories changed tone overnight. The stubborn rancher blocking progress became the landowner who had warned everyone. Headlines shifted from development dispute to regulatory failure. The same outlets that had once painted me as the villain now replayed footage of Lydia shouting while investigators stood unmoved. The houses themselves stood half-ruined, their clean lines broken by mud, cracks, and standing water. Sheetrock swelled, framing warped. Streets that had been proudly named weeks earlier were now cordoned off with tape. They looked less like homes and more like exhibits, frozen in time as proof of what happens when speed replaces caution. People in town stopped whispering when I walked past. Some avoided eye contact out of embarrassment. Others nodded quietly, as if acknowledging something they should have understood sooner. No one argued any more about who had been right. I did not celebrate. I did not gloat. I stood at the edge of the site one evening and watched the sun set over unfinished rooftops, the light catching puddles where lawns were supposed to be. It was not satisfaction I felt. It was gravity settling back into place. Lydia's project had been built on confidence, pressure, and the assumption that no one would slow down enough to challenge it. In the end, it was undone by records, patience, and laws that did not bend to authority manufactured in meeting rooms. The ranch was still scarred. The land would take time to heal. But the illusion that had consumed it was gone, washed away by truth, paperwork, and a system that finally refused to look the other way. Those houses would never be finished. They would stand as reminders that arrogance builds fast, but it collapses just as quickly when it finally meets something real. The aftermath did not arrive with fireworks or dramatic announcements. It came the way real consequences usually do, slow and methodical, carried on official letters and quiet meetings rather than sirens. Once the stop work orders were in place, everything that had been rushed forward was forced to move at the speed of law, and that speed favored truth. High Mesa Estates unraveled piece by piece. The Homeowners Association was suspended almost immediately while investigations continued. Within weeks, it formally dissolved under the weight of legal pressure it could no longer deflect. Board members who had once spoken with absolute certainty now communicated only through attorneys. The confident emails and glossy flyers vanished, replaced by court filings and settlement notices. Buyers were the first concern addressed by regulators. Insurance companies that had initially balked at coverage stepped in once the full scope of the misrepresentation became clear. Contracts were voided. Deposits were refunded. Families who had been rushed into believing they were buying safe homes were made whole through settlements and recovery funds. It was not instant and it was not painless, but no one was left carrying the loss alone. The land itself became the next priority. Federal and state agencies reclassified the area according to flood control standards that should have applied from the beginning. Portions of the development footprint were stripped back, damaged foundations removed, and drainage pathways restored. Engineers walked the site with maps that showed how water had always intended to move. For the first time since the bulldozers arrived, the land was treated like land again instead of a blank canvas. Through a series of court orders and negotiated reversions, significant portions of my ranch were returned to me. Fence lines were reestablished. Easements were corrected. The paperwork that had once erased my boundaries now restored them, line by line, signature by signature. Standing out there again, watching grass push through disturbed soil, felt like seeing a wound finally start to close. Marlene became unexpectedly central to what came next. The county, embarrassed by how easily its systems had been manipulated, asked her to sit on an advisory panel reviewing zoning and emergency approval procedures. She approached it the same way she had approached those dusty files in the basement, carefully, quietly, and without ego. New rules were drafted to require deeper historical reviews, longer notice periods, and independent verification for developments near critical infrastructure. Earl was brought in as a consultant on dam safety upgrades and communication protocols. He made sure future seasonal releases would be better publicized and better understood, not hidden behind technical language that only specialists read. He said more than once that none of this should have been controversial in the first place. The town changed too, in ways that were harder to measure. People stopped whispering when I walked into a room. Some came by the ranch to apologize, awkwardly at first, then more openly. A few admitted they had believed the headlines. Others said they had been afraid to speak up once the momentum felt unstoppable. I listened to all of it without arguing. Understanding arrived late, but it arrived. Local businesses that had distanced themselves quietly returned. Neighbors waved again, this time without hesitation. Conversations shifted from blame to reflection. Red Willow Ridge had been forced to see how quickly familiar ground could be sold out from under itself. No one called me stubborn anymore. They stopped using words like difficult and uncooperative. Instead, they used a different word, one that surprised me when I heard it the first time: patient. Not because I had waited out a weakness, but because I had trusted something larger than speed and noise. I had let a system older and steadier than any HOA meeting do what it was designed to do. The ranch was not exactly the same as it had been before. Scars remained, both in the land and in the town's memory. But it was still standing, still mine. And now, finally, protected by people who understood what had almost been lost. Progress, I learned, is not measured by how fast you build. Sometimes, it is measured by how carefully you stop. These days, I sit on the same porch my grandfather built with his own hands, listening to the quiet that finally feels earned. The water moves the way it always should have, steady and controlled, following rules written long before anyone thought they could outvote nature. The pasture looks different now. There are scars where concrete once tried to claim permanence, but the land is breathing again. It is mine, not because I fought louder than anyone else, but because I waited longer than they expected. I learned something through all of this that I wish I had not had to learn the hard way. Corruption is always in a hurry. It depends on speed, confusion, and people being too tired or too scared to slow things down. Truth does not work that way. Truth is patient. It lives in records, in old manuals, in laws that do not care who is smiling at a microphone. And when truth finally catches up, it does not need to shout. It simply stands there and lets everything false fall apart on its own. If you ever find yourself up against an HOA that waves paperwork like a weapon and tells you resistance is pointless, remember this. Real authority does not come from clipboards, votes taken in a rush, or so-called emergencies designed to silence questions. It comes from laws built to protect people, land, and communities long after bullies lose their titles. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, Where are you watching from?